Hence, the notion of voluntariness is most basic and inseparable from ethics. From the foregoing explanation of the basic concepts of ethics, we see the clear distinction between the concept immoral and amoral, between moral and normal, and between perversity and peculiarity or anomaly. So, the first distinction is immoral. Immoral is the contradictory of moral. It means contrary to or violative of the rules of right conduct. So, amoral means morally indifferent. When speaking of morality, being moral and immoral can be understood as two opposite actions. Immoral ay opposite ng moral. Ang pagiging immoral is when the individual is not concerned with the principles of right and wrong. So, for example, it is either good or bad yung nagagawa niya sa kanyang sarili. The immoral person can steal, hurt, lie, and etc. And that's because the sense of morality in the person is minimal. So, the second one is moral. Moral is distinguished from normal in that the latter refers to a physical or psychological standard and has no reference to moral rectitude. Then, speaking of moral naman, is when an individual is concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior. So, a moral person is palaging sumusunod sa mga principles or standards of behavior. A perfectly normal person can be very immoral in his life, whereas an abnormal person can be very moral in his acts and live in accordance with the moral law. So, ang example naman ng moral is ang moral person ay hindi niya gagawin ang magnakaw o kumuha ng gamit na hindi naman sa kanya. So, the difference between peculiarity and perversity is fundamentally the same as that between abnormality and immorality. And it is the difference between the physical or psychological and the moral. So, perversity or perversion always involves moral turpitude and responsibility. So, ang perversity is kapag mas pinili mong mag-act in a way na hindi makatwiran, contrary, or just plain wrong, and ang pagiging sadyang pagsalungat, paggawa ng kabaliktaran sa mga expect o gusto ng mga tao na gawin mo is what you call perversity. Then, while yung peculiarity or anomaly naman ay unlike sa perversity. Peculiarity is yung kakaiba sa'yo or kakaibang katangian. Like for example, you might curious or conscious about sa tenga mo na hindi pantay or mata. Basta something na halatang kakaiba sa'yo sa sarili mo is yun yung tinatawag na peculiarity. So, in the last distinction is important to make and remember in judging the morality of an act. The moral quality and responsibility of a person and in proportioning punishment to wrongdoing. History tells us sad examples of crimes imputed arising from the confusion of the two. So, for instance, homosexuals in the past for the accident and misfortune of being born with the sexual peculiarity. So, were not only ostracized from society, they were punished like the worst criminals, put into exile, hung, buried alive, burned at the stake, were refused even the last sacraments on dying. To the further study on voluntariness. The concept of voluntariness is extremely important in ethics because, so just like what my groupmate said, ethics deals precisely with the study of human acts. So, for example, the voluntary acts of a man. And the second one is, it is the amount or degree of voluntariness present in an act which determines the amount of or degree of responsibility, and this term will determine the amount the amount of punishment, if any, to be meted out. Hence, it is in order now to inquire into the nature of voluntariness. So we distinguish between two. So the first one is perfect involuntariness and imperfect voluntariness. So perfect voluntariness comes with full consent. So meaning, sa perfect voluntariness is kung saan yung tao is kumbaga buo ang intensyon and kusang loob ang pagkilos na nilalayon. While yung sa imperfect voluntariness is occurs when there's no perfect knowledge nor concept, or when either or both of the knowledge or consent is partial. So dito naman sa imperfect voluntariness is yung kung saan ang mga kilos ng isang tao is without fully realizing kung ano ang ibig niyang gawin, or without fully intended the act. So, we also distinguish between direct voluntary act and indirect voluntary act. So, direct voluntary act, an act is directly voluntary, also called voluntary in SE. When the act is intended for its own sake, either as a means or as an end. So, ang direct voluntary act is kung ano yung pinipiling gawin ng isang tao, which is ginagawa niya ito dahil yun ang napili niyang gawin. Kumbaga, hindi siya napipilitan na gawin ang isang bagay. So, for example, he who intended to go a party in order to drink with friends. So, bakit niya gusto pumunta sa party? So, siyempre, pumunta siya sa party para uminom. So, willingness niya pa lang na magsama sa party and yung kagustuhan, makipag-inuman sa mga kaibigan niya is considered na yun na direct voluntary act. So, why? Because direct voluntary act is depends on what you decided, what you want to do, and the knowledge of doing so. So, the second one is indirect voluntary act. An indirect voluntary act, also called voluntary in causa, is an act which is not intended for its own sake, but which merely follow as a regrettable consequence of an action directly willed. So, meaning to say, yung indirect voluntary act naman is unintended, which is may scenario na unexpected na mangyayari. So, pwede na gawin yung isang bagay pag pinili nilang gawin yon. Kumbaga, nakadepende sa choices nila whether gawin nila or hindi. To put it simply, ang indirect voluntary act is yung resulta ng direct voluntary act. So, para mas maliwanagan kayo kung ano yung pagkaiba ng direct voluntary act and indirect voluntary act is mag-cite tayo ng mga examples. See, this is the first example. Throwing precious cargoes from a sinking boat to save lives of passengers. So, on this example, there's an unexpected scene which is the boat is sinking. So, ang direct voluntary act doon is yung pagtapon mo ng mga karga sa tubig para hindi lumubog yung barko. Then, ang indirect voluntary act doon is yung resulta ng pagtapon mo ng karga, which is dahil doon is nasave mo yung buhay ng mga tao. Then, the second example is the unintended, though foreseen, killing of non-combatants as a result of the bombing of a military objective. So, on this example, is yung hindi mo sinadya na mapatay yung mga non-combatants as a result of the bombing of the military. So, ang direct voluntary act naman dito is yung pagbomba ng mga military. And then, ang indirect voluntary act dito is yung result, which is yung pagkamatay ng mga non-combatants. Then, the last example is going to a party to enjoy with friends but making trouble when drunk. So, dito naman is unintended and foreseen na magkaroon pala ng trouble while nasa party at nag-iinuman. So, ang direct voluntary act naman dito is yung pagpunta ng party kasi kagustuhan nila kung bakit sila pumunta sa party. Then, Ang indirect voluntary act naman dito is yung pagkaroon ng gulo, which is kaya nangyari yun ay dahil nalasing sila sa party as a result na nakagawa sila ng trouble. So, meron dito questions. So, why is an indirect voluntary act still voluntary when it is not intended and follows only as a regrettable side issue? So, the answer is that when we will to do an act, we will the whole act including its consequences. And since we place the cause, we also indirectly will the affect. So, although this is in itself regrettable, we are therefore responsible for the consequences of our actions, even if these are not intended. So, meaning to say, kapag gumawa tayo ng act, kailangan handa tayo sa mga pwedeng maging consequences. Kailangan responsible ka sa every act na gagawin mo even though it is not intended.